Okay, thank you all for coming, and then thanks PJ for inviting me. I feel as if I'm like an affiliate faculty member of the IIIT, and it's always great to come here. And before I start, I also want to say that it's always intimidating to have to give a talk in front of your own teachers. And Ignan Garu is the person who taught me AI, and he's there. So I'm so happy that he showed up, but I'm also going to be nervous. So okay, so I am going to talk to you about this beyond nodding and pointing, widening, explainable, and advisable human AI interaction. What do I mean by that? Okay, so you guys are all talking about AI systems these days, and they don't behave, and they don't when they make a decision, they don't tell you why they made the decision. When you ask them to change their behavior, it's a very slow process. In particular, the way what has become dealing with AI systems has been explanations by pointing. So if you ask an AI system, why is this a dog? First of all, I don't quite know why people ask AI systems why something is a dog. But if you do ask it, then the best it will try to do is to show the saliency regions, the parts of the pixels that seem to have had a bigger influence in making that label come to be a dog. We'll talk about how saliency is some idea, but on the other hand, actually pointing is the most primitive form of explanation. Human civilization invented a lot more than just pointing, but we are stuck with that as explanations from AI systems. On the other hand, if you're trying to advise the AI systems, you know that the GPT-4 and ChatGPT, as egregious as they are sometimes in their completions and their racist, sexist, yet factual completions, they try to make them slightly better by essentially human feedback. They have this RLHF, reinforcement learning from human feedback. There's a question as to whether RL is actually needed, or whether the human feedback is the signal that's added on top of the pre-trained model to just change the weights. But either which way, you are nodding, okay? You're being shown two different answers to the prompts. And since you have no life else other than to train ChatGPT, especially if you're being paid poorly in Nigeria or something, you're being shown these two essays and you say, yeah, this is right. Yeah, this is right. And so in which case, these nods until your head falls off will become the loose signals that are used to train these systems to behave better. I know that once in a while we nod to our kids, but we talk to them. We actually advise them. And so what do we want to do? What we want to do is we want to have AI systems that are actually easier for humans to use, machines which will provide explanations, not by pointing, because pointing doesn't even work. If you ask me, Rao, why the heck did you come 1 full week back when your talk is today? I have to give you an answer for that. But to do that, what am I going to point to? I have to point to a video of my life, a sort of a space-time signal tube of my life, and say, look, these pieces, these pieces, these pieces. At which point you'll realize I should never ask Rao for explanations because it's going to be very boring. We instead use abstract linguistic explanations for those kinds of scenarios. And similarly, when advice, we want to be able to give advice in ways that are easier for humans. We tend to do things in symbolic terms. And so advice as well as explanations should be allowable in symbolic terms. And the big point I want to do is just because that has to be in symbolic terms doesn't mean that the AI system's internal reasoning has to be using old symbolic reasoning techniques. I like symbolic reasoning techniques. I've done them. But you want to use AI systems that are actually using, some other sorts of deep reinforcement learning from pixel space or something. That's completely fine with me. You can do your reasoning any which way you want. In fact, I have no idea how most of you do your reasoning. I don't know what happens in your heads. But when I talk to you, you don't point, you don't grunt, you use language that I can understand. You use symbolic explanations. And I want the AI systems to use symbolic explanations and take symbolic advice. That's the basic gist of what I'm trying to do in my research. And I'll tell you how we will do it and how to, and some of the work that's been going on in my lab in trying to make that happen. Okay, that's my basic point of it. So anyway, my research background, most of it is in human AI interaction of late, but I started in planning and decision making. And then I also, as I mentioned, as people mentioned, I mean, I spend a bunch of time, since everybody is an expert, and since I am actually an expert because I took Professor Ignana's course way before AI was cool, okay? I mean, I tell people that I was in AI before AI was cool. So I keep trying to explain to people things that my perspective on AI. So I've written a bunch of these articles that might be of interest, including the changing nature of AI research. AI used to be an engineering discipline, but now we take AI has become whatever OpenAI has released last week and try to poke it and see what it does. So we become sort of ersatz biologists. You know, biologists basically take rats and cats and whatever funny animals they'll find and poke them to see what it does. That's what AI is becoming to some extent. And, you know, I talk about that. I also wrote a thing on ChatGPT, since everybody should. And I gave a talk on generative AI revolution, what happens to our reality when AI can spin many synthetic realities. I'm sure many of you wish that I would talk about that rather than whatever else I'm talking about today. But, you know, that is a different day's talk. You know, we basically, an interesting bunch of things can be talked about in, you know, the misunderstandings about LLMs, you know, that exist even on the research scholars that are sitting here, because we are all essentially collectively deluding ourselves on certain things. They're impressive achievements, but, you know, we need to be careful about how we use them. One thing I do want to mention is people keep saying that LLMs or large language models sometimes hallucinate. No. They always hallucinate. Sometimes their hallucination happens to align with your reality. And then you say, wow, that's nice. Okay, it's like astrology. Astrology says random stuff. Sometimes it happens to be what happened. You give it credit. When it is wrong, you'll never care about it. So that's why astrology is alive and well, because the denominator is never going to increase, even if it's wrong. You know, so in terms of LLMs and reasoning abilities, that is very much the case. We actually have a paper showing that large language models cannot even provide a 3-block stacking plan. Okay, if I put 3 blocks in one configuration, want it in a different configuration, and they have to just come out with the sequence of moves, they look like sequence of moves. But if you actually try to execute them, the plan will fail, because there was no real reason to believe that the reasoning would have happened anyway. So we actually show that about 3% of the time, which is way less than what is allowed by even just the statistical noise, they tend to be correct. Most of the time, they're actually wrong. But that doesn't mean that they're useless. They're actually useful in the following sense. They can give a plan that can be used as a heuristic guidance for somebody who actually knows how to do planning. You ask your friend, hey, guy, I'm stuck. Can you give me an idea? And they give an idea. Even if that idea is a bozo idea, if you can use that idea, you're happy. You can change it. And you know what your problems constraints are, and then this heuristic guidance can help you. And that's a way of actually using LLMs that I believe is a much more reasonable thing. Have human in the loop when you're using LLMs for whatever thing that you're doing. Okay, so that's something that I just want to mention on the side. You know, there's a bunch of things about that. If you're interested in that, you can read that paper. Again, the talk for today itself is this 3-part thing. I want to talk about, because after all, I'll talk about explanations and advice. I want to talk about first, even though I'm not a psychologist, but everybody, computer scientists are supposed to be psychologists, anthropologists, everything, because we have computers. So I act like a psychologist today and tell you what do people do when they exchange explanations in general. Okay, so kind of some higher level points. And then we talk about how we use that as an inspiration to provide an explanation framework for AI systems. First, in the case when the AI systems wind up doing search with basically symbolic reasoning methods. And then in the third part, we extend that to talk about scenarios where the AI systems don't do symbolic reasoning methods at all, but yet they give the explanation in methods in the same symbolic means. That the point again, as I said, is I don't know how you think, but you need to make sense to me. You should not. I personally feel that if, in fact, the whole promise of AI systems is that whenever we are not happy with what happened, 176 billion parameter large language model, you stop doing what you're doing and try to go through all the weights to see which weight is the bad one, have a life. This is not what we're supposed to be doing. The system should be helping us, not us debugging them. And so I want the explanations and advice themselves to be in terms that we can understand. And I'll talk to you about that in the third part. Okay, so the first part. So how do humans exchange explanations? First of all, there is the pointing and tacit explanations. Little kids, we have no language, essentially just point to things that they want. And if you ask them, who threw that bottle, they'll point to their brother, because they don't want to take the blame. So that's the explanations that they will start with. But pointing explanations are essentially very high bandwidth, because especially, as I said, if I'm talking about an explanation for a sequential decision as to why did you come 2 weeks back, or why did you take this particular flight, why did you use this decision in a sequential decision scenario, it's no longer an image you're talking about. You're talking about a space-time signal tube over which you need to point to the regions that are relevant. And that is a very high bandwidth, cognitively high overload thing. And to some extent, I can argue that maybe, I don't know, I wasn't there when the cavemen and cavewomen invented language, but they must have gotten sick and tired of exchanging these explanations over space-time signal tubes. And they said, hey, let's just start having language. The facetiousness aside, symbolic or explicit explanations tend to be essentially in symbolic terms, which are abstractions over space-time signal tubes, okay? And language essentially is an abstraction over these signals. And we use that a lot more. And typically pointing explanations are used for tacit knowledge tasks, the tasks that for which we do them, but we don't know how to do them. So for example, if you ask me, how do you swim, Rao? It's extremely hard to explain. I just have to show you how to swim. Whereas on the other hand, if you ask me, how do you play a chess, I can give you exactly the procedure that I use to play chess. And those are explicit knowledge tasks for which we tend to use explicit, a language-based explanation. And one of the funny things is, we are such linguistic animals that even for tacit knowledge tasks, we tend to use language. We have New York Times food critics who describe how food is. What a sad life, essentially. I mean, that's what LLMs do, for example. They have never tasted a mango, but they can write you 3 or 4 page essay about how mangoes taste, okay? You can do that. But what's interesting is, and similarly in cricket is as tacit as it gets, because there are a few rules, but mostly it's all physical motion and so on. You have these crazy concepts like leg before wicket, which only the godly umpires know and the rest of us complain about, right? It's a concept which is actually, you're putting a symbolic term over a purely tacit knowledge task. And we actually do this. That's how language evolves. Keep that in mind. So why do AI systems have to give explanations? They can use it in multiple ways. First of all, people tend to use explanations in symbolic terms. Those of you who have already heard of these things like chain of thought prompting. Chain of thought prompting is self-explanations at certain level. Okay, so you can use internal explanations as for yourself. You can I'm mostly interested in using external explanations, in particular external explanations to humans in the loop, because you can give external explanation to other systems. And I think that half-life time for that is too low, because eventually all systems will have like a hive mind. And so there is no real reason why systems have to talk to each other the way that we talk to each other. They have USB plugs. We still, if Elon Musk hasn't figured out some random thing, we still don't have USB plugs. So we have to be talked to in linguistic terms, right? And so external explanations for human in the loop is what I'm most interested in. It's also, people will say, there are things where, people don't seem to ask for explanations, but when you tend to require explanations, when the task is a high stakes decision, if I decide that I won't give you the loan, you want to know why I'm not giving you the loan. If I decide that you should be put in jail for 15 years, you would say, why not 14? And can you give me an explanation? Whereas if Facebook says, maybe you're interested in this page 25 billion times a day, you might say, screw it, because I'm not going to care about what Facebook tells me anyway. So this is why, for example, some people will say explanations are not important because Facebook is giving all these recommendations. Nobody asks for explanations because they're all ignoring those recommendations to begin with. But in some cases where the decisions are important, we actually care about explanations. The use cases, of course, are as debuggers, which is different from actually providing explanations to humans to work with them in a collaborative scenario, which is a lot more what I am interested in. And again, one other big difference that I want to focus on is one-shot versus sequential decisions. In the case of sequential decisions, the symbolic explanations become a lot more important because there's no image. There is actually a video. It's like a generalized video of some sort. And then there are like these terms that float about, and I want to mention the difference. I am talking mostly about explanations, mostly about explanations, which are being given by the machine to a specific human in the loop as to why, when that human asks, why did you do this decision? That's what you're doing. You're giving that explanation to that human in the loop. Interpretability is whether or not humanity as a whole understand what the heck ChatGPT is doing. That's very different from, Rosetta Stone is interpretable. Can any of you read Rosetta Stone? It's not explicable to you. It's just interpretable to the humanity as a whole. It's a very different kind of a concept. And finally, certificates of correctness are a third thing where if you ask, you give a solution and I say, it's optimal, and I say, give me a proof for optimality, you might give like a 3 gigabit search tree trace. That's not meant for people. That's meant for people's AI systems to actually chug through that to see whether or not the certificate of correctness actually is holding. These are important, but I'm mostly focusing on the explanations. I just wanted to mention that. And you may actually be using sometimes these 3 terms kind of interchangeably, and I want you to think of the differences between them. Requirements and explanations. When you're giving explanations, you want to be comprehensible. If you just blabber until people get tired and say, okay, fine, you do what you do. That's a great thing, but that's not what we are focusing on. Communicability. It should be easy to exchange. It should be a smaller explanations are easier to exchange than 3 terabyte dumps. Okay. Soundness. A guarantee from the other party that this explanation is really the reason for the decision. That means if you kind of falsify the conditions of that explanation, that the decision should change. So if somebody says you didn't get the loan because your bank balance in this one other account is less than $100, and then you borrow $2 and put it such that it becomes more than $100, they should consider changing that. If not, the explanation was not sound to begin with. Okay. A related, basically, sort of guarantee to stand behind the explanation you are providing. And finally, satisfaction, which is actually a very important thing. People should be satisfied with the explanation they're getting on one hand, but on the other hand, people are full of cognitive flaws. I can give you an explanation that makes you happy without actually explaining why I took the decision. I can lie. I can give you what you want to hear. All of these essentially slippery slope. And in fact, one of my biggest nightmares is, those of you who have heard of GDPR, and GDPR has this rule that essentially machine decisions have to be explainable. Okay, so that means there should be some text saying, here is the reason I did this. Somebody pretty soon will connect ChatGPT to whatever the decision maker. You ask, ChatGPT makes up an explanation. Okay, and it's not at all connected to the reason the decision was made by the system, but the people are satisfied. And so satisfaction with the explanations is actually important, but is also a slippery slope. You want to understand that. Okay, so that's a little about how humans do it. And I want to talk a little about how we did it for symbolic systems. It's kind of work that sort of completed more or less in the last year or so. And I want to talk about it before going to the most recent work. So how to do the kind of explanations people exchange to each other, and how do you do it if you, for example, assume that in my particular case, I'm interested in planning systems, which make sequential decisions, and they're symbolic planning systems. And there's a human in the loop who asks, why this plan? Why not a different plan? Why this particular step here? Why not a different step? You should be able to provide a reason. These are called explanations, file-based explanations. I want to tell you how we do that. And it turns out it's connected to the mental models. In general, the biggest point about explanations for humans is mental models. When I'm not talking to myself, hopefully, I'm talking to you. And so I need to know where your level of understanding is about the task, and I need to be talking to that point of view. And similarly, when there is this question from the human to a machine about why this particular decision was made, their model of the task probably told them that a separate decision was much better. But if to the extent the machine says this decision that it made is the right one, it needs to change the human's model of the task. So explanation is really mental model reconciliation. If all of us think about the world the same way, we don't ever have to talk to each other. You understand what I'm saying? Because world-less collaboration. Because we think about the world exactly the same way, our preferences, our needs, everything are the same, then we don't need to talk. It'll be a sad life, but at least we don't have to talk. Okay. So what does it take for AI agent to show explainable behavior in the presence of human agents? Managing mental models. That's really the important thing. And you might say, if you ever see an explanations paper which doesn't talk about models, that's because they must have just picked the default model for the human, rather than actually realize that different people can have different models of the task. So this is really the first principles way to think about it. And how many of you have heard of Sally-Ann test here? Sure. Okay, so I mean, obviously this is an engineering school, and as I say, engineers and human subject skills are kind of contradictory. But so let me tell you what Sally-Ann test is. Sally in this red blouse comes in and puts the ball in the yellow basket. This is a 245 quiz. Okay, those of you who are the students should pay attention. Sally puts her box in the yellow box, then Sally goes out. Then Anne comes in, puts the ball in the gray box, and goes out. Now that Sally comes in. You all are looking at this while this whole tamasha is going on. Okay. My question is, when Sally comes in, where will she look for her ball? That's all my question is. Those of you who are thinking about it, you're in big trouble. That might explain why you have no friends, because you don't have mental models of other people, and you're talking to yourself. And that's why you don't have any friends. Friends means talking to people and you're having mental models. So you all know what happened, because you know that Sally, while you know the ball is in the gray box, you also know that Sally thinks that the ball is in the yellow box, because of which you know that Sally will be looking in the yellow box. Interestingly, psychologists have shown that kids below 3 years of age have trouble. They actually tend to think that what they believe is believed by everybody else too. In fact, it's even more interesting stuff. Infants tend to think that their body is connected to the universe, like this whole kumbaya thing. And then they slowly realize that the body is disconnected from the rest of the universe. And then they slowly realize that their beliefs are also different from the other people's beliefs. Then they figure that out. They started learning to do mental modeling. And you know what else comes when they do mental modeling? They can tell you nice, sweet lies. Lies don't work if you believe that everybody knows the same thing you know. What are you lying to? Okay. So I kid around that when my kid started telling his first lie, I said, man, this guy's brain is working, because at least he has the second level ability of mental modeling. And explanations are about other people's models of the world and reconciling it. Talking to yourself is not an explanation. That's what I want you to understand. So let's start with the tale of three models. How do I implement this? If you have, basically, I will look at, for this part of this talk, and I'll look at models of the task as a PDDL, in which is, a planning domain definition language, which is a symbolic representation of actions, preconditions, and effects. But as I said in the third part, I'll talk about other kinds of, in fact, much of this has also been done for other representations, such as MDPs with atomic representations. But it's good enough to look at this as the example for today's talk, and especially for this part. And as I said, the development is agnostic to the specific representation. So if you are the only agent in the world, you have nobody else around you, then you have a task and you know the actions and their preconditions and effects, and you want to achieve some state of affairs, some goal. So you put these actions together to reach the goal. That's the planning problem. That's really the million-dollar question for any intelligent agent. What do I do to reach my goals that I have set for myself? Okay. So it has one model. I would call this MR. This is the model of the robot. Robot's model about how the world works. The moment you have the human in the loop, human might very well have a different model of how the world works. The task itself might be viewed differently by the human than the robot. In fact, if there are two people are involved in the task, they may not have a shared mental model, in which case that's the reason why they wind up asking questions to each other. Okay, so I would call the human's mental model M of H. So they have another model of how that the world works, which they probably have. One difference might be, for example, the same actions, but this guy has fewer preconditions or extra effects compared to the robot's model. Okay. The more interesting part, so in fact, if the robot realizes that the human has a separate model, then that's when the robot realizes that its goals are different, possibly from the human's goals. And to the extent we don't want robots to take over, you want them to help us, or at least not run us over. You want robots to recognize our intentions, get out of our way, maybe help us if possible. Okay, that is all about the whole activity recognition stuff and intention projection stuff. That's the first level of mental modeling, at least realizing that the other person's model of the task is different from your model of the task. And there's a lot of literature on this. We have done this too. Then in fact, the robot can also, to help the human where it's going, it can project its intentions. The way we talk, we can also use different kinds of, in this case, it's using HoloLens sorts of things to give a heads up to the human in the loop where it's going. That's like the first order. The point that actually I'm going to be focusing on today is the second order, which is humans anthropomorphize everything. They anthropomorphize rocks. They anthropomorphize, moving stick figures. So they certainly anthropomorphize robots. So the moment you have a robot in the loop, all humans would think that a robot has a model of the world, and they try to approximate that model of the world. So they guess what that model is. That is MRH. So they have an expectation on the robot's model, which is MR's approximation for humans level, which is MRH. The interesting thing is, if the robot behaves according to MRH, humans are happy, because that's what I expect you to do. That's what you're doing. If the robot behaves differently from what MRH is, they are surprised. They may be spooked, and they might ask, why did you do that? In all these cases, the robot has essentially one of two options, as we'll point out. Either it can essentially act in accordance with MRH, or try to change MRH to be closer to MR. How do you change somebody else's model of you? You talk to them. So essentially, explanations are your ability, your effort in trying to change their expectation of your actions and their preconditions and effects. You tend to, when people ask, why didn't you do this? You then tell them an additional constraint you had in your life that they weren't aware of. The moment they realize the constraint, like for example, if I tell you, my nephew got married last week, then you say, yeah, that makes sense. You must have come for that last week. So I gave you extra information about my model, and that reconciled your model closer to me. Those are explanations. So model differences with the humans in the loop, plans that are optimal to the robot in MR may well be inconsistent, invalid, or at least inoptimal with respect to MRH. Because these are two different models of the same world. If you are optimal with respect to this, there's no reason why it have to be optimal with respect. If they aren't, then they become inexplicable plans. That is, the human would be surprised that this is not the plan I expected you to do. When there are inexplicable plans, the robot then has two options. One is conform to the expectations or change the expectations. By the way, that's exactly what we do. I mean, those of you who are PhD students, if you're advisor things, you should be writing 2 papers a day. Either conform to the expectations, in which case they won't yell at you at all, or change their expectations, saying, do you know how people behave? They have life and stuff. They can't write 2 papers. 1.5 is minimum, but 2 is too much, I think. Okay, but anyway, the point is, either you can conform to people's expectations, in which case you don't have to talk at all. Really, in fact, the way you want to avoid, some people don't like talking, the way they can avoid talking is just do what people expect you to do. Then they won't be asking you anything. But the reason we don't do that is because conforming to other people's expectations might be costly from our perspective, from our model. If it is costly for you, those of you who are not writing 2 papers because it's too costly for you to write 2 papers. Okay. If it's costly for you, it can be costly for the robot too. And the robot, basically the MRs, with respect to the MR, the plan that is expected, the optimal with respect to MRH, might well be too costly according to MR. At which point the robot tries to resolve the perceived suboptimality by changing basically changing the mental model of the human. And in my case, the mental model essentially is changing the effects and preconditions of the actions that the human has attributed to the robot's actions. Just like I gave you extra constraint that you weren't aware of, you can say that this is extra precondition you were not aware of. There's this additional effect that you're not aware of. So explanation is essentially exchanging of these. So to give you an idea in a more prosaic scenario, this is a sort of a fake search and rescue scenario where essentially in this particular corridors, there's a robot in this on the ground, and basically the map of the ground, the map of the floor is known to the robot as well as the human upfront, which essentially means MR equal to MH in the beginning, and MRH is equal to MR originally. But then because when the robot starts going around, it may well be that it's actually there's rubble because it's like a search and rescue scenario. There is like things have fallen off and some particular paths are closed. There's rubble and so on. So in this particular case, this path is actually the optimal path according to the original model, which is what then human expects the robot to do. But the robot knows that that path is actually impossible because I put that fake obstacle there. It can do one of two things, which is remove the obstacle and then walk through it, or try to tell them that that path is closed, I'm taking a different path. So that's basically what happens in terms of explicability versus explanation. So in the first example, it actually changed it basically removed the obstacle. So it actually extra work just so that it went through the path that the humans were expecting to. Don't laugh at it because sometimes, as I say, if you have a ride and you're going from North Rim to South Rim of the Grand Canyon, and you put your friend on the South Rim and say, pick me up there, and then you walk a little bit, and then you feel like you can't go all the way to South Rim. You can't get back to North Rim because there is no actual ride there. The ride is only on the South Rim. And if those of you who don't know, North Rim to South Rim is 10 miles as crows fly. And since you are not crows, it's 240 miles to go around. Okay, 240 miles, you better be explicable. Okay, because somehow or other get to the South Rim so that you will get your ride. And that sort of a thing sometimes is the right thing to do. So when you're doing that, you are no longer optimizing the plan with respect to the cost of the plan with respect to your own model. You're also optimizing the distance of the plan with respect to the expected plan that the human has. So it's a different optimization function where you're trying to be as close to what the human expects you to do as possible. It's a different kind of an optimization thing, and you can actually support that. But on the other hand, if you don't want to do that, you want to provide an explanation, essentially you kind of add epsilon to MHR, that is the human's approximation of the robot's model, such that you can add this precondition to your action, as this effect to your action, remove this effect, and so on and so forth. That would be the explanation construction. And you want to compute the least number of these precondition effect changes such that the action, the plan that you have becomes the optimal. That's what explanation construction. And by this time, you sort of know that explanation really is sort of reconciling your human's model MHR to robot's model MR. Okay. So the case I
is clear.
okay, I'm not going to do this.
The path from P7 to P5 is clear.
Here the
The
other
path
one.
from P1
So
to P8 is not clear.
that is the explanation. And the human is, there is this interesting point. Just because I provided this broadcast, whether or not that you heard the broadcast and changed your model of the robot is still open. Right? People give you explanations, you may not actually listen to them. And then you are very surprised afterwards. But I'm hoping that if the robot does say it, one pay attention, in which case then essentially they are going to change their model. So they would not be surprised as to why. Okay. It turns out that computing this kind of an explanation is a search in the space of models. These models are actions with application effects. Each node in the search space is a model itself. This one is MR, this one is MRH, and the robot is trying to the AI system is the robot is trying to compute a path through this, and then using that path, it basically computing it. It turns out because this is bidirectional, you can go this way or this way, and that changes the nature of explanation. Sometimes you give the minimal explanation, and that should satisfy people. But then if they falsify it, then you will come up with another reason as to why you still can't do it. That would be called minimally complete, but not monotonic explanation. The other one where you want to give the explanation, and in one case, the search goes in one direction, the other case, the search goes in the different direction. Okay. So now how does one other point in coming understanding this is how does the AI agent get the human model? Because if you want to reason about the mental models, you need to learn the mental model. You need to have the mental model. I talked about the inference part of it up until. So one of the points is that in many cases, you might very well start with a shared model. Like in that particular search and rescue scenario, the path, the model of the floor is known to both of them. So that was the common model. And so you just keep track of the drift from the model. The robot basically can then tell what is MRH. Even if robot doesn't know the exact model MRH, if it thinks that it's one of these 5 models, then it can give an explanation that would satisfy irrespective of which of these 5 models the human has. Those of you who have background in planning, you would think of this as a conformant planning, which is trying to give a plan that will work, more than one model. Okay, sort of it. In other cases, more generally, AI agent needs to learn the human's mental models. And the point of is this thing working? Okay. The point, of course, is that learning from human traces, learning human models from human traces has been done quite a bit. The difference is that would get you MH. You want MRH. It's not what you do, it's what you expect the robot to do. That's a little harder learning problem. So you actually have to set it up in such a way that you get humans' preferences over other people's behavior. And then use that as the data for learning the model, and that will be your MRH. And from there, you then can do this model reconstruction. The other thing this is all about humans and AI systems. And as I said earlier, engineers and humans, whether or not you can say that I'm a human, so I know how humans think, which is a reasonable thing, except we are all engineers, many of you are engineers, and that's a questionable judgment, right? So in general, if you are trying to make judgments about whether or not humans will like some things, whether or not humans will like certain kinds of explanations, you have to set up systematic human subject studies. Those of the people who think they're interested in human aware or human AI interaction and have never heard of IRB, which is Institutional Review Board, which comes into play whenever you're trying to do experiments with humans, they're faking it. Okay, so in our case, we actually, and in fact, one of the examples of that, classic example of that is the Tesla. Elon Musk basically said, it's very easy for humans to essentially let the car go at full speed and while they're playing on their iPad, and when the car then says beep, beep, you come back to full attention in 3 milliseconds. Not hard for him apparently, and he thought it is not hard for anybody else. And tell that to that poor guy in Florida who was playing on his iPad and went right under the truck because he couldn't come back to full attention in 3 milliseconds. That was a failure because you have wrong expectations of what humans can and cannot do. And so to actually evaluate these sort of things, you have to have human subject studies. We do that. And in fact, to actually show that the kind of explanations that we compute help people in collaborative scenarios when the humans are working with robots, we essentially have designed studies which actually gamify the situation so that people get points when they work together with the robot, and use that to see whether or not the explanations are helping them in increasing their scores. So there's a paper on that in HRI 2019 as well as the HCI journal. These are human-computer interaction, etc. You have to deal with it. If you really care about humans, you need to care about humans. You can't just say, I'm human, so whatever is making sense to me is making sense to humans in general. What makes sense to you is making the deadline to submit your paper, which is not really what is important about human AI interaction. Okay, so you need to do human factors evaluation. One last thing about this part of the talk is that actually when and why do humans ask for explanations from each other, and then you can actually compare those scenarios to what this model does, and I can make reasonable arguments that it actually conforms to human explanation giving and this particular way of computing explanations as model reconciliation. It's a dense slide, so I'm not going to go into it in detail. There's a whole bunch of extensions of this basic scenario. You can allow model reconciliation on non-PDL domains. If you are interested in MTPs or atomic models, you can do that. You can consider different kinds of interpretable behavior. You can consider explanations where you know that you're doing something that would be baffling to the human in the loop and give an explanation proactively, or you wait for the human to ask a question. Most teachers, when they explain something, when they're teaching, they depend on you asking questions. Why? We know that you never ask questions. So the best way to teach is you go on and say, any questions? And then people, and then they go back to their cell phones. I go back to my thing. That's called file-based explanations. You have to actually ask a question, then I can answer, which is like a lazier way of explaining, right? But that's actually supported too. And then you can allow for multiple human agents. Different human agents will have different MHs and different MRHs. Okay, and so you will then provide. In fact, a surgeon giving an explanation as to why you need an operation in the next 3 days will give an explanation for you in one way and to her colleagues in a different way, because the language is different. Your model of surgery is very very abstract compared to which is a lot more complex, a lot more detailed. So that is actually supportable. We have all of those things are papers that you can actually go back and read. And then finally, one last thing I mentioned about deception, lies. My son's telling lies because he knew that he can deal with mental models. If you have explanations, you're trying to support collaborative behavior. Collaborative behavior basically means you deal with humans' mental models. Once you learn the humans' mental models, you can use it for the good as well as the bad. Every knife is a dual-edged, every technology is a dual-edged sword. Okay, and this is no different. Mental modeling can be used for good, which is cooperation, can be used for bad, which is for deception. So in fact, the robots can provide this explanation that would be happy, that would kind of convince you, but that's not the real explanation at all. So in fact, we have written papers showing how you can do a behavior which is simultaneously interpretable or explicable to the friends, but deceiving to the enemies. So at the same time, you are essentially making these mental models and using both the mental models to compute a plan that makes sense to this guy, but gives the wrong information to the other. Okay, so that deception is very much part of the deal. So you can, in fact, lie with mental models too. And one of the other things is explanations on the whole in longitudinal interaction, explanations are transitory. If you are talking to somebody you have never talked to, you ask them for explanations as to why they are doing it. If you have talked to them for work with them for 6-7 years, you assume they know what they're doing. You stop asking for explanations. Why? Because you trust them. You think they must have a reason. You see what I'm saying? So explanations are used to engender trust, and then you can go back to your life. So in fact, we have a paper in HRI 2000 this year, that my student presented last week, where we have the system doing explicable behavior so that the human is happy with the robot's behavior until their trust increases, at which point of time our robot does what is optimal for it, while making sure, in our case, that it's not actually harmful to the human, but it makes its life easy. Which is not surprising when in the beginning, when you're a new PhD student, your advisors will come and look into your room to see whether you are not working. So then you have to make sure that you are up like this. And then after a while, they trust you after you write your 2 papers per day in 10 for about a year. Then they'll trust you. At which point you can get your bed and sleep in the room. They are not checking because they trust you. You understand what I'm saying? That's the same thing that can happen to AI systems, that we actually use that to leverage. So this part of this whole research has actually been written up. There's a book on that, and it has all these pieces described in more detail. Okay, that's the second part. That's the one on symbolic pieces. Now, given the same idea of what an explanation is, I want to talk about how to do this when the system is not talking about a symbolic reasoning at all. It is doing reasoning in a very different representation. But then, as I said, the explanation that it computes has to be in the language I can understand. So this is basically our argument that people keep talking about. There's some holdouts keep talking about, no. Ultimately, we need to have symbolic reasoning, blah, blah, blah. Maybe they're right, maybe they're wrong. But the important thing is that symbols should become a lingua franca. Whether or not the AI system is doing reasoning in symbolic terms, it should be able to provide explanations in symbolic terms. It should be able to take advice in symbolic terms. So post hoc symbolic explanations and accommodating symbolic advice into inscrutable systems is what we are mostly doing of late. In general, when you have a vocabulary mismatch, as I said, this is basically the MRH idea, then you need to either be explicable or provide explanations. Explanations in the sense, in the absence of shared vocabulary, your first inclination is to just point to the shared image, because the image is something that both of you can see. So you point. You know what I'm saying? So, but the pointing is, as I said earlier, pointing is the most primitive part of explanations. It doesn't even generalize to sequential decision problems, which is actually why most of the saliency region explanations are focused on one-shot decisions, because for that there is at least an image. Otherwise, you have to look at any video. And more importantly, we know that saliency regions are bogus, because most of you know this is a bus and this is an ostrich, right? All of you know this. My question is, tell me which part of this makes it an ostrich. The explanation would be a bunch of random pixels. That's not an explanation. Saliency regions don't really give explanatory power, okay? But we kind of get by with it. And much of explanation XAI in machine learning has been focusing on these sorts of saliency regions, and that's not good enough. Pointing explanations are hard to comprehend, and because and then in some sense, humans use more symbolic explanations. That's something that I mentioned earlier. So AI systems must be explainable and advisable, and it should be in our terms, not in their terms. I'm not going to debug the system to understand how it's working. It should tell me why. And we should design them in such a way that those explanations can be trusted. And as I mentioned, I do want this to be made, this point to make this point that I'm not talking about internal symbolic reasoning, which is, I'm not saying the AI system should internally use symbolic reasoning. Some people think that irrespective of whether you come from pixels or sensory information, the machine might very well learn symbolic abstractions, and then it'll be a symbolic machine. But as Wittgenstein said, even if a lion were to speak, you may not understand. Because understanding is about shared vocabulary. And there's no reason to believe that a machine which goes from pixels to symbols as abstractions has an abstraction that coincides anywhere with the kind of abstractions we have for our world. Instead, what I'm focusing on is, I don't care how you deal with your reasoning inside. When you open your mouth, use words that I understand. When I open my mouth, take my words and change your behavior. That's basically what we're pushing for. So the use case for symbolic layer is that everything will have sort of a symbolic interface, and the explanations are generated in terms of symbolic terms, and the advice is also taken in the symbolic terms. This all looks very high level, so I will show you some papers and then come. So there's an IIIT 2022 paper last year, which basically shows in this scenario where there is this is a Montezuma revenge Atari game, where the system is actually doing deep reinforcement learning on the RAM states. RAM states are not pixel states, but they're also completely inscrutable to humans. And so it comes up with a move, and the human might ask, why are you taking this move? Why not this other move? And these moves actually have symbolic preconditions effects from the perspective of the humans, but the machine has a very different representation. When you ask for this foil representation, it needs to learn a local symbolic model around that decision and use that to provide the explanation. That's what we wind up doing. And those of you who have done some explanation in machine learning might have heard of LIME system, which will do local linear approximations of the models. I'm doing local symbolic approximations of the model. and using that to provide information. Okay. And the interesting details are kind of important, but I don't have too much time to go into them. But the way when the foil is given, essentially the machine can try to do behaviors, sample behaviors using that action and see if it works. And most of the time they will fail, because that's the reason the machine didn't pick that. And then it needs to provide a reason for the failure. And in the failure case, it needs to figure out which preconditions and effects can explain the failure. Now, when I said preconditions and effects, you might ask, where are the preconditions and effects coming from? That is the shared vocabulary the machine has with the human. It's not using that to think, but it is using that to communicate. You see what I'm saying? Only at the time of taking advice and taking explanations, it uses the shared vocabulary. Its own thinking is its own internal representation. So that's what we wind up doing. One of the interesting things is, since it is converting what might effectively be some kind of a saliency explanation, internal representation, into these symbolic explanations, the translation can be buggy. And so even it can see that my explanation is only partially valid. So it can compute develop the confidence level for the translation, and use that confidence level to avoid creating explanations that build undeserved trust, or at that time increase the shared vocabulary. You ask the human to give you more terms to use in providing the explanation. In general, language expands when we get stuck trying to explain something to somebody else. Then you look for additional words that make sense to both of you, and then you use that to continue the explanation. So that's basically what happens there. We again do human subject studies to show that these kinds of explanations are preferred to saliency explanations by humans in the loop and in the loop. In the case of accepting advice, this is your RLHF stuff, right? Basically, just nodding, saying this is right, this is wrong. And that's too weak a signal. What we want is to provide an advice with an accompanying explanation, which can then be used by the machine to use the same input in many more scenarios. Okay, that's the basic idea. So to do that, there's a paper, NeurIPS in 2021, which essentially was in the context of this driving domain scenario, where every once in a while the machine might ask the human for, is this action fine for this particular state? So to actually look at the human's preferences, and when the human provides the correct action, they might also provide the objects in the game which are relevant for that particular action being correct. So you might say you should be braking because there is a stop sign. Now, stop sign is an object that makes sense to humans. The machine may well be thinking in terms of pixels. What it can then do is basically put a region around the stop sign, and that becomes the saliency region. And you keep that constant and disturb the region outside, perturb that region to get many more pictures with this particular region kept constant. Those all become scenarios where the action will still be the suggested action will still be the right action. So you are kind of amplifying. This is imagine this as augmenting the advice. You are data augmenting the advice data with the explanation. So this is sort of context-aware data augmentation of a kind. It turns out that it's a lot more efficient than just going with binary nodding sort of things. And so in fact, it improves the sample complexity of getting your advice to a deep reinforcement learning system. This is a very recent paper. This is actually going to be presented in IIIT 23, where you can see that you can talk about providing an explicit symbolic function or writing the symbolic function for an RL agent, hand-coded one. Really what we want is, even if it is a tacit knowledge task, something like walking, which is not symbolic at all, you may still use symbolic terms. You may say, walk faster, walk slower, walk softer, okay? And these are what are called relative attributes. They are attributes of degree at which how fast the walking has to be going. And we can learn the grounding of these relative attributes and use them to improve, to basically interpret the advice that the human is giving to the AI. So relative behavior like keywords, So again, as part of this, we wind up learning the grounding of the attributes. In this particular case, we learn like a grounding of that relative attributes as a ranking function, and use that to actually come up with behaviors that are in the right direction. When the human says walk faster, you can then generate behaviors that actually have higher value in the walking faster relative attribute ranking function. This is much better than being shown two different walks and say which one do you like. That's basically a lot more examples would be needed. Once again, it turns out that with this sort of a representation, with this sort of a relative attributes representation, can reduce the number of samples that the humans would need to give to the robots to actually get their preferences across. And that's the kind of studies that we show that basically the sample complexity increases significantly. In general, RLHF is a very sad way to learn because you're trying to learn an extremely weak signal. You want to widen the signal. That's what I mentioned earlier, widening, explanation and advice beyond nodding and pointing. That's the other part. So one other last thing here is, even though I'm talking about scenarios where you essentially have human in the loop and you have actual decisions being made, even if in fact humans themselves are not talking and they're actually providing demonstrations which are non-verbal, so multimodal demonstrations, you interpret human demonstrations in terms of the vocabulary that you share with them. Those of you who played Antakshari or mime, pantomime games know that you are basically trying to interpret the behavior in terms of words that you both share. And that actually winds up being again a point here. So we have a paper showing that if you have shared vocabulary and you take time to ground that shared vocabulary, then you can reduce the ambiguity in the demonstrations that the humans are showing. So actually, this second part is actually open area. Right now, we are working on this in addition to those papers. In general, there's like a research agenda here. There's a paper last year, a Blue Sky paper, on what are the outstanding research problem in making sure that this kind of symbolic lingua franca can be established. That involves collecting the initial concept set, rounding the concept set, as well as vocabulary expansion. This paper actually lays out like the challenges in more depth, but I'll just quickly say that the collecting initial set, one of the interesting things is something like scene graphs that people talk about. If you have like an image and you have a scene graph description of it, the scene graph description is already in the shared vocabulary terms. Because when you say the scene corresponds to this door being next to this window being door, window, all of humans understand. That's why the machine is actually interpreting it in the context of the human concepts already. So you can use that as the basis. One of the interesting questions is how to expand. When you get stuck in providing the right explanation, you may have to expand the vocabulary. The grounding the concepts is actually an important thing. We actually do this in part of our work. But once you ground the concept set, it gets amortized over all the interactions, subsequent interactions. Once you realize the meaning, you can use it in multiple other data scenarios. Okay. Vocabulary expansion is an important thing. Sometimes the machine might need more words from the human, so it might actually ask for additional shared concepts that it can use in later explanations. Sometimes the machine might actually provide the vocabulary to the human. Those of you who heard of the AlphaGo 37th move, many of you heard about it, where I don't even know how to play Go. I barely know how to play chess, but I understand that the AlphaGo 37th move was very perplexing to the human experts. And they don't exactly know why it works. Now, when you say, I don't know why something works, obviously it worked, that poor guy got defeated, that's an explanation, but you're not happy with it. You want an explanation, in essence, in some sort of symbolic term, saying when these patterns exist, then you can again use this kind of a move. To do that, there is no pattern, which is why there's no word for the pattern that the machine is seeing. That's what made people unhappy to some extent. So in some work that DeepMind was doing with one other person, Dean Kim in Google, they were essentially using this vocabulary expansion in the reverse way, where the machine teaches the human there is a place where we both should come up with a new name. So that next time onward, that new name becomes a shared. You see what I'm saying? So we're establishing a common ground. So in summary, in part one, I kind of tried to explain to you why and how humans exchange explanations and take advice. And the part two, I talked about the essential foundational nature of explanations being model reconciliation, how you can do that in a variety of scenarios. And part three, I talked about how to support explainable behavior, even without a shared vocabulary, where essentially you kind of you get the shared vocabulary, you ground it, and use that to actually still generate symbolic explanation, still take symbolic advice, even though you're doing your own reasoning in non-symbolic terms. Now, I want to leave you with this one last thought, with that maybe humans originally started language this way, but eventually we came to a point where we oftentimes think in language already. At least, I know that introspection is a lousy form of psychology, but we tend to think in language. In fact, I remember thinking in Telugu until I went to IIT and I started thinking in English, and sort of we have a mental language and so on. And so a symbolic interface I put to deal with other dweebs around me because I need to exchange information with them, sort of define my very personality. It'll be interesting to see if AI systems, when they fake a symbolic interface, will suddenly wind up actually becoming a lot more like us. But that's like a way far into the future. I don't want to talk about that. And thank you for your attention. Do I get out, or do you have what do you do? What? Okay, thank you. Please go ahead. Okay, if you have any questions, I might hear. Yes, go ahead. Come on.
There was a good amount of work on exceptional handling and things going wrong and connecting yourselves and so on. And then there was this team agent communication languages and how they share knowledge. So does this work encompass all those things in some way?
So my sense basically is that I tend to believe that machines don't need a language to communicate with each other, because ultimately I think all machines can have a hive mind. Okay, there is that connection. In fact, that's why I said explanations are exchanged to yourself, which is self-explanations, or with other agents, and with other agents can be other machines or other humans. I'm most interested in whether other agents are human, because that's where all these other issues come. Things like reconciliation still matter with the machines, but eventually my sense is that you can actually make them all have the same model by just kind of plugging them all to behave that way. So that's in that sense, it's unnecessarily hard problem to solve with the robot. Yeah, go ahead, please go ahead. Become coherent, but they are adversary. So first of all, there are like two different ways. So in the sense that robot is trying to deceive human, that is very much possible. I'm most interested in looking at the collaborative scenarios, but as I said, the machine can certainly use explanations to deceive. There's a paper that I mentioned that I didn't talk about. It's in AI ethics and society, a conference actually I helped start. We had a paper in that in 2019, where we looked at using this explanatory scenario and checking. We know, first of all, that human society will fall apart if we don't tell each other white lies, at least. Like if I ever ask you, how do I look? I'm telling you the answer is great, because otherwise you won't have any friends, right? We always tell each other white lies, okay? The question is, and white lies have advantages. Like, for example, would you not like your Alexa when to say, hey, you're looking good after you come back from a run, even though you're stinking and you're sweaty. But if it says you're looking good, maybe you'll feel good, and then maybe you'll start running more. Certainly, it helps with people saying it to you. Would you like AI systems to also tell you white lies? Which is a very interesting, ethically loaded question. We actually studied that. And we basically set up experiments where the humans, being told lies to, in some cases knew that the other side is a human, in some cases didn't know whether the other side is a human or a machine. And our findings at that point is that people were fine with being told white lies by other humans, but not fine if they thought that it was a machine. Okay, but that's a very interesting question because we still tend to think that machines don't have empathy, and so we should not be like they're just doing some canned thing, as against like actually feeling that you're looking good after running. So that's one thing. The other way of looking at interpreting this point is the explanations typically when I am trying to conform to your explanation, your expectations, and basically sometimes both of us are learning at the same time. The robot is learning your mental model. The human is also correcting their mental model of the robot. So sometimes it can go across. So when I went to CMU, I was obviously like a good citizen walking on the left. And then the bozos there were walking on their right. We kept bumping into each other. Then they realized this bozo came from somewhere else. He is not going to change. Let's change. And they started work. Whenever they see me, they start working on the left. By which time, being an IIT student myself, I also learned and I decided to start working on the right. So we again bumped into each other. This sort of an oscillation occurs in mental model reconciliation. That's also an interesting issue. So sometimes you just keep doing what you're doing, the world will conform to you, essentially, because humans will get adapted to anything, right, ultimately. So in a way, actually, explanations are probably less important if you just don't care about humans being inconvenienced. If the machine keeps doing this, they will just adopt their mental model of the machine, and there is no more surprise at that point. The surprise can then come if the machine actually becomes more rational. Then you will yes.
Yeah. Here.
Yes. Go ahead.
Yeah. So good afternoon, Professor. So just like you were talking about AlphaGo's 37th move thing. I had a couple of questions. So say, for example, the disagreement between all the Go players for the 37th move was some amount, say X or something, if we quantify that. I was wondering, can't we use a chain-like system, like maybe some disagreement for the first move and then just, carry that streak forward? Because, using that chain mechanism that at every move, probably there must be some disagreement. So instead of trying to find that why it selected the 37th move as a particular, trying to identify patterns in them, can't we just start it from like the first thing?
So that's actually an interesting point about this whole issue of localized versus like cumulative explanation. People tend to be less satisfied with cumulative explanations. You say you understood something when you can, this is not, this is like psychological support for this. When you understand something, then you can actually have like a concept, and the concept may well have essentially abstracted this chain-like thing into a particular symbolic concept. Then they will be happy. But I understand that this is sort of harking back to that earlier slide when they talked about proofs, certificates of correctness versus explanation. And explanations to the humans have to be comprehensible and short.
Oh.
And the kind of thing you're talking about may not be short.
Okay. And the second question was, okay, I'm sorry. Yeah, sure.
Okay. Thank you very much. And I'm here. You are welcome to talk to me. Thank you.